This is Nicholas Alexiou from the Hellenic American Project, Queen's College and the Department of Sociology. And today in our series of oral history interviews, we are very happy, very pleased and very honored to have an interview with Mr. Guy Kaldis.
Kaldis.
Or Kaldis.
Kaldis in Greek.
Yes. We're going to examine, we're going to explore, we're going to be in this endeavor of his own life and also the family's life, and of course the very renowned and well-known painter Aristodimos Kaldis, who was your father. Mr. Kaldis, Guy, thank you very much for the interview today. And let's start by saying your name and where you were born and where you grew up.
Okay, I'm named Guy Constantine Kaldis. Constantine after my father's favorite uncle, Constantine Christopoulos. My cousin married a Christopoulos. Can you believe that? But she never took his name. Anyway. My father came here to this country in 1917 and landed at Newport News on a freighter. He knew a lot of the people who were in shipping, so he probably got a free ride knowing my father. And he eventually landed in Watertown, where he worked at a Hood Rubber Company plant, which during the war. You know, the war started for us in 1918. And finished in 1918, so we weren't in it very long. But he got involved in being a interpreter, and then got involved in politics, and then he moved to New York in the 30s. I know very little bit about him in the 20s, but in the 30s.
But where he came from?
He was born in Dikili, Artanefs, Turkey, which is the port that you take to go to Lesbos. My grandfather was from Lesbos, Mytilene, and my grandmother, Urania, was from Pergamon area. She had a farm there. And my father was born in 1899, August 15th, by the Turkish passport, which he used. He never had a Greek passport. And I found out recently from my cousin that his education mostly was in, Asia Minor. What happened is that at age 14, he was thrust into one of the family's businesses, which was a shipping business, loosely affiliated with the Livanos family. And he hated it, absolutely hated it. It was
a big family though, right?
Well, he was the third child of four boys. There was Polydactus, there was Byron, and my father, and the youngest was Christos. And Byron died at age 30, according to my father, which he never told me in a timely fashion, with urinary problems. But my cousin by Christos is named Byron. His son, Christos' son is Byron.
It is very striking that at a very young age of 14, he went into the shipping business.
He hated it. He absolutely hated it. He said, I don't believe in the physical world, I believe in the metaphysical world, was his common statement. And so he came to the United States and by freighter to Newport News, and then worked his way up to the Boston area. And he was involved, in making boots, and I assume that that's how he got his American citizenship, by working in the war effort for making boots, the Hood Rubber Company. And he knew a lot of the radicals of the area. He knew Sacco and Vanzetti. He actually was arrested, I found out, by misspelling his name 5 different ways in the New York Times. He was arrested for a protest of the execution of Sacco and Vanzetti. He came to New York sometime in the 30s, and he knew a woman, a Greek woman, who had been adopted as a baby by Isadora Duncan, who'd lost her natural children to a car accident. And her name is Madame Torres. I have a portrait of her if you'd like me to insert it later. But my mother had come to the United States to visit my Uncle Guy, who, after graduating from, public school at 18, went to work in a leather goods factory that was working with my Uncle Joe. My Uncle Joe was a multimillionaire in the leather goods business. And he liked being there in Germany so much that he stayed even after the war started a month later. Notice he went there in like July, and the war started on my birthday, August 1st, 1914. I wasn't born in 1914, but 23 years later. Anyway, what happened is by November, the Germans rounded up every British citizenship and put them in a camp. But that camp became my uncle's college and graduate education, because there were professors there. Professors started to teach. The professors started to teach postdoctorate courses, and then they realized, wait a second, there's so many people here who are merchant seamen and bootblacks that were, rounded up in Germany. They couldn't even read or write in English. So they started a school, and they started, my grandmother sent food and books to Guy, and we had the American embassy was, of course, near this. It was a place, Ruhleben, now part of Berlin, but at that time it was a suburb, a near suburb in the northwest, very near where the Olympic Games were done in '36. I have a feeling that might have been taken down to make way for the Olympic Games. But anyway, what happened is it became a tremendous thing. There were 55 dramatic societies. My uncle was a member of Irish Players. I have his notes on the play Countess Kathleen by William Butler Yeats. It just was the thing. And he also, there were art exhibits in the thing. People they had all this time in the world because, they didn't have to do things. They didn't have chores. So they created an English society and even an English Trafalgar Square in the middle of the thing. But the living conditions were very, very Spartan. 10 people to a horse stall, not properly insulated for the winter.
Yeah. As a historian yourself, you realize that the 30s is the period of the Depression.
Yeah, so, but this was before. This was 1914 to 1918. Yeah. He was there for 1919. He was there for 5 years.
And when your father came here in New York in the 30s, it was a very difficult.
No, he came in to New York City.
New York City.
Yeah, it was difficult. Very.
Difficult. But already a Greek American community was established.
Yeah.
Do you know if he had any contacts with the community?
Yes. He had 3 roommates. One who was Jewish, Harry Roskolenko, who wrote a book called Poet on a Scooter, and who actually wrote some mentions about my father in that book. He got the Vespa scooter from the factory and went all around the world. Crazy guy. But there was another guy, I think it might have been a Turk. There were 4 roommates, and they lived in Hell's Kitchen, and it was a very rough area. They literally formed convoys. They wouldn't leave or enter Hell's Kitchen except if they were together. So they had appointed hours for leaving Hell's Kitchen to go elsewhere, and appointed hours for meeting up and going back in. So 4 guys could handle any ruffians.
And they did...
and it was rough.
Different types of jobs they
yeah.
had?
My father got involved in labor unions. He was the job that J Cobb had on the waterfront. He was the guy that they got to speak to the labor, the workers to get in line. He had a commanding presence, so, and he could speak very well. But what happened is, you ask about the poverty at the time. Well, they found out that there was an Orthodox Jew was giving away food. So they went to the temple, and the rabbi asked him, "Are you Orthodox?" And they said, "Yes." He didn't ask if they were Orthodox Jewish, but that's a nice story. Anyway,
and this is the time he got involved with politics, more in politics.
Yeah, he was a Trotskyite at that time. When my father was. There were a lot of people in that union were very leftist, and they led a strike in 1933 that was very successful. It only lasted 2 weeks. They shut down every single restaurant in light club in New York City, with the help of the literati like Heywood Broun and Dorothy Parker, who told their affluent friends, "Don't go out. The restaurants are shut down." And my father led a group of chefs at a Waldorf Astoria who reneged on the deal that they had made. In other words, the deal was that everyone should be rehired, and the Waldorf felt that they didn't need to hire the troublemakers, the people who had organized the strike within Waldorf Astoria. I later found out that one of my teachers at Harvard had been a Columbia graduate student and was involved with that movement. It was sort of funny.
And later, when a group of Greeks went to fight the fascists in Spain, in the civil war in Spain,
yeah.
Your father was very supportive, and he tried to communicate messages.
He never talked about that.
He was aware of.
I had
of the situation.
My mother had a first cousin who was a newspaper reporter, who was in Spain, and now he was a Canadian, and now James MacDonald Menifee, who was my mother's first cousin, his family had gone to my grandfather's sister. He had married a guy called Menifee, and they went to Canada, to Saskatchewan. And my uncle was a very bright guy, athletic. He got a Rhodes Scholarship. After the war, he was in the Canadian Army. He met an artist from America, had a son, and came to America. And he worked with the Herald Tribune, the New York Times, and during World War II. After his experience in the Spanish Civil War, he was a member of the OSS in Italy. He interviewed Count Ciano just before Count Ciano tried to flee in an airplane, but Mussolini heard about it and shot him down.
And when your father became friends with Gorgi?
That would be after, but we haven't gotten to where my father met my mother.
Before we go there.
Oh, you want to go ahead in time?
I want to ask you,
okay,
because you grew up, or part of you growing up is a period of the Cold War, and because of your father's involvement in the leftist movement, you sense any kind of discrimination or some kind of...
Oh yeah, when I was a little boy, about 12, I was playing with stamps, and suddenly I heard this radio report about a woman that we were going to stay with a week to that day. We were going to go up to Monhegan and stay with her for a week. And it turns out that she committed suicide. She jumped off the rocks in Monhegan. Well, what happened is, in the fall, this was in the summer, in the fall, people representing themselves as sheriffs from Maine, my mother was a total ingenue when it came to, thinking the worst of people. They were obviously FBI people, because they were saying that she had left a note saying that her husband wasn't giving her the money on time, the alimony on time. But then they went to her safe deposit box in New York and found 30 grand, which was a lot of money in those days when I was 12. Anyway, long story short, they concocted this idea that the communists threw her over the cliff. And so they came down to my mother, who was working at the museum in RISD in Providence, and they kept her busy for over an hour. And I said, Mother, and they knew about my father. That's where I'm getting at. They asked her about my father's activities. Well, my father stopped being active in politics after he married my mother. He was active in the union business, because she gave me that as one reason for leaving him, was that he would disappear overnight. And my father explained it that he was playing cards to stay in tight with the other union guys. But my father hated he got to hate the union because he said he didn't see that he was really uplifting them, their life, any. He said, he put it very crudely, he said, I think they just flushed the toilet a few more times. And what really discouraged him was he tried to get the European system of including the tip in the bill, and they were not for it.
How a person born in Asia Minor, a Greek, immigrant, working class, met an American woman, fall in love and get married? How your
what
father
happened
met
is
your mother?
What happened is that my uncle Guy was a sailor, and he was asked to go along with the person that my friend, that my mother's friend that committed suicide. They went to Amityville. My uncle, by the way, even though he was in prison with the Germans, was not anti-German. He had many German friends in the Amityville area, which was a very German-dominated place at that time. And this was 1928. And what happened is, it was a very stormy day, probably near gale, 40 to 45 miles an hour, probably. And it was a very tall sailboat, racing style boat, and they foolishly wouldn't say no. So my uncle said, I'm the most experienced person, I'll take the place of this guy who knows very little about sailing. And when they went through the Fire Island Inlet, where Robert Moses Park is on one side, and the winds were coming from every which way. The waves, I've been told that at 30 miles an hour, from personal observance, the waves are 10 feet tall. So I would imagine the waves that knocked over this boat were probably 12 to 15 feet tall. Anyway, that's what caused my mother to come to America, because the girlfriend ordered the most expensive Campbell & Son funeral in New York City, okay? And my grandfather had pretty well spent his money. My mother referred to him as an alcoholic. My cousin's wife, who was an enabler of an alcoholic, said, oh no, he just liked to enjoy himself. Anyway, my grandfather didn't have the money to pay for the funeral, so my mother felt obligated to come and pay it over time. She took his job. She was 25 at the time. She had been, since her early 20s, many times, spent many summers. She had learned about art from a Chinese art dealer who's Eurasian, A.W. Barr. This guy sold jades and Yellow River scrolls to the Whitneys and the Vanderbilts, which are now, you can see in the Metropolitan Museum. But when I got married, he gave us a nice little print of a bird, about a 19th century, Chinese watercolor. But she learned a lot from him, and so when she took over my uncle's job, within 4 years, at age 29 in 1932, she was made co-editor of Art News. She interviewed, the funny story is she interviewed Gertrude Stein and Aristodimos. My mother was very ethical, but I guess as a news reporter, she dropped some of her ethics and she bribed somebody to find out where the two had come when they came back from, France. They probably sensed that Hitler was going to take over, and they were the first to leave. And she found out the apartment number, got in the elevator, knocked on the door, and Alice B. Toklas came to the door and says, Gertrude Stein doesn't do interviews in New York. But eventually my mother got the interview.
A very prestigious magazine.
Yeah, yeah. It was the major art news magazine at that time.
And for how long she worked there? She was but not critic, right?
She was a critic from 1925 to 28 to 32, and I think she had a false pregnancy when she was 35. In 1935 when she, and I think she resigned from that job, and that was when she'd already met my father, because my father was a friend of this wonderful ballet dancer, Maria Torres, Mrs. Bourgeois, and they had a pension, or not a pension, a soiree in Brooklyn Heights, where all the famous people, literary people, came. So my mother was invited by her critic, Stefan Bourgeois. He knew my uncle, because I found a first edition of some French book about, anyway, it had some beautiful woodcuts in it, where Stefan Bourgeois gave back the book to my uncle. But his wife knew my father. She was Greek. And I found out recently that she taught all the Greek ladies not only ballet, but all the Horiatic dances, And I think she was probably a left-leaning person herself. But in any case, at that meeting, my father looked at her with his deep brown eyes the whole evening, and shortly after that he said, "Let's get married now or never." They were married within a month. And
that's a great story.
But so I came around in 37. My mother was pregnant with me, obviously, late December or late November. And she said to my father, "You can't bring a child into this world in New York City." I was born in New York City, but my father had located an apartment in Croton, or Harmon, it's called. It was overlooking the railroad yards of the New York Central. Croton is a major express stop on the things, and it's the terminal stop of the Metro North now. Anyway, this woman was a playwright, a very famous playwright, Margaret Mayo, and she had written a play called Twin Beds that supposedly, according to my father, basically created the fad for twin beds. And she also I found out recently that she was challenged to write a play within a day, and she did it in 23 hours. And more recently I found out what my father didn't know. He did know that she went to Hollywood and was the mistress of Louis B. Mayer, but she was one of the 4 founders of the Goldwing Company. She had married, as an actress and as a playwright, she had married another person who was a director, Arthur Selwyn. And he happened to have a half-brother named Samuel Goldfuss. Goldfuss, Selwyn, Samuel Goldwyn. So she was the great aunt of Tony Goldwyn, the actor today. But
And where you grew up?
I say for the first year, I grew up in Croton. I was blonde, curly hair, and there was a dog. I think she had a dog in the background. My son has them. My oldest son has the pictures, and he's supposed to do them. But at age 1, my mother decided, my mother would get, all through my early life, she would get these small remittances from rich relatives. And it was enough to go to Europe on a boat. So at a year old, we debarked at Southampton. I was wet. My mother was in a summer dress, and it was freezing cold, because of the water and the wind. And my father said, "Oh, I'll give the guy a guinea, and he'll let us right through the head of the line." And my mother said, "Oh, no." My mother was very, English people can't be corrupted. And my father said, "Yeah, they can." We went in. But we were there, and the minute the relatives found out that my father was a good talker, they wanted him to meet Uncle Joe, because Uncle Joe was planning to leave all his millions to the Salvation Army. I don't give to the Salvation Army. My family is given plenty. But what happened is Uncle Joe was a member of Parliament. He was the Lord Mayor. He was a mayor of Walsall. And when he died, and which I found out recently, I ordered a little profile book of him about the size of a Time magazine of his life, that he died not, at the end of the month of August, when I was there in 38. And it took his wife 4 years to get the town of Walsall to agree to his 14-bell carillon that he gave them. And the guy was extremely wealthy. He had leather goods going all around the world. He and my grandfather had made a killing on horses in the military in the Boer War. But, bits and spurs, but my uncle made all kinds of leather goods, and he was all over. And that's why my Uncle Guy went to Germany to a leather factory rather than to work for his father in a bits and spurs thing. It was very dull. Anyway, long story short, we ended up in Greece, and we lived in Greece in Ipsiko. I just found out that one of my father's relatives, Manuel Kaldis, who's a big, I think he's the Kaldis, if you look under the name Kaldis, he's the one he comes up the most because he's a brilliant physicist. And he found an apartment in a very swanky neighborhood of Ipsiko, literally across the street from Prince Paul, who was later to become King Paul. And we stayed there. And I think, had my parents stayed there in Greece, the marriage might have had a better chance of lasting longer, because, as my mother explained, the reason for leaving when we got back was that it was hard to live off the seat of my father's pants, but impossible if you had 3 people living off the seat of his pants. My father didn't have regular jobs.
At what age you came back to the States?
I was 3 years old. No. Yes, 3 years old, 1940. We came back early in 1940, before Ohi Day. We didn't wait that long. It was right after the Italians were beaten in the Balkans. That's when there was a threat to draft my father in the Greek army, even though he had a Turkish passport. And he went to Greece and England under a Turkish passport with me in the picture.
I've seen this picture in various catalogs of your father's.
Yeah.
Tell us a few things about this picture.
Okay, this was me at about age 4 in 1941 in a studio that he had, and he put this in several catalogs. It was done by a good friend of ours, Frances Avery, who was a member of she was like the oldest female member of the National Arts Club when she died at 97 or 98. Just a terrific woman. She would go to museums, and she would bring a movie camera and just and then she would slow it down to slow down when she was projecting it for viewers so you could see what was going on. But no, I was very close to my father, even though at age 3 we came back to Lower East Side, and in the winter of 1940, we shuffled off to Buffalo. My mother and I left my father behind. And that's when he had his first exhibition, and when he sold a painting to Dr. Barnes.
At that age, you remember your father painting?
Yes, and one of the things that happened is he would come up and visit me in Buffalo, and we would do tempera paintings on poster boards, backs of posters, and unfortunately, he was really angry at my mother when she moved to Providence from Buffalo. She left those behind.
And this is here in New York?
Yeah, this was at about 5 years old, 42, in New York City in Washington Square Park, or, not Washington Square North, looking at Washington Square Park. I still can remember a certain fragrance from one of the bushes in Washington Square Park, because I associate that with the ice cream man that was nearby. Anyway, I would visit my father 4 times a year for a week at a time. And at that time, I would meet all my father's friends. He was very close with Franz Klein. He even encouraged Klein to use color, which made his dealer, Sidney Janis, really upset, because he had a niche as a, painter of black lines with paint, with a painter's brush, a house painter's brush, as opposed to, an artist's brush. And the funny thing about Klein was he was a very sweet man, and he loved my dad because he did a group of pen and ink sketches of my father on cedar bar menus that my father treasured. And he was just a very sweet guy, but he was colorblind, which explains why he did the black. But he had a Jaguar, and he'd drive my father, and my father would be like this. He'd tell him, that's a red light. But my father knew a lot of different artists. De Kooning was his closest friend. My father, for example, after I left, my father did a series of lectures called The Key to Modern Art, and they were held in recital rooms that he rented from Carnegie Hall. I don't know if you're aware that in Carnegie Hall there are back offices and there are many small recital rooms. So
this is how...
and Bill de Kooning ran the slide projector.
This is how also we can explain that although Aristodimos never had a formal education in fine arts, he knew...
what I forgot to mention is...
painters.
We forgot to mention is after my mother had this hysterical pregnancy before I was born, they were working on the WPA, and that's where my father met Diego Rivera, and he was kibitzing Diego Rivera about a painting that he was doing, and Diego turned to him and he said, "Hey, Kaldis, you're the artist. Here's the brushes, here's the painting, here's the paints, here's the canvas." And that's where. And the painting in the other room, the still life, was my father's first painting. That was 1939.
Your mother was an art critic.
Yeah.
What she was thinking about Aristodimos as a painter?
Okay. My mother was super ethical. When she was working at the Albert Art Knox Gallery in Buffalo, the director wanted to buy a painting, and my mother said that would look very suspicious. Conflict of interest. She was extreme about that. Unlike we have a Supreme Court justice whose wife makes millions of dollars raising money from rich donors to fight conservative causes. My mother was very, very ethical, and it's one of the reasons.
But as far as concerned the aesthetics,
But she did not write about art, about my father's art. I can tell you that.
But she knew the value.
She knew about it.
Value. This is what I'm trying to
She
find
knew
out.
the value. She certainly was
The
impressed.
artistic value,
She was,
not
yes.
the monetary value.
Yeah, but she was impressed by, the fact that Barnes bought it. But, I think she had a rather larger view. She put together a book about my uncle's writings after he was died. And, her aesthetic was different. She included a painting of a cow that a professor from University of Rhode Island had done, and my father said, "Oh, what was that all about?" But my father used to take my uncle's book, and he had a copy of it, and he would take it and get Xeroxes of it, and he would give out one section. He said, because there's never been any work on Seurat. And he told me the reason why there's no work written about Seurat is there were very few paintings. So there was nobody who could be given a painting to write a review. This essay that's in Reaching for Art by Guy Eglinton is about the fauves and about the thing. And was my father went around with it in his hand and would give it to artists that he felt were worthy.
And also, your father was a very prolific speaker.
Yeah.
He gave many lectures.
Right.
Legendary
Yeah.
lectures.
And I just sent away, I'm sending away, using Legacy Box, I sent away a reel-to-reel tape of a lecture at the Artists Club. My father was such a frequent speaker at the Artists Club. One time, we were supposed to go to a meeting at Green Street when I was visiting, and we arrived and the hall was empty. They had moved the venue because they were tired of my father hogging the floor. What my father would do at a meeting is he would size up what everybody else said, and then he would distill out of that the best. And my father was always using dialectic, thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. And he felt that was the way you did paintings. That was his aesthetic. And he used, the other term he used was the liquids and the solids. Liquids and the solids, as in thesis and antithesis, coming up with a synthesis of that. But
in the hardcore oil, right? No,
always
acrylics.
always oil. Except he spent a lot of time in the hospital, not in doctor's office. That's why he spent a lot of time in hospitals, and he did a lot of works on paper with magic markers eventually, and before that with craypas, a lot of craypas. I have a lot of craypas drawings of my father, and they were basically of some of the pictures that you see around.
I would like us to give us some insight. This long, a very strong friendship with de Kooning and also his sister.
Okay, yeah, I also, my father spoke about de Kooning in a lecture that I have recorded, and that's going to be available. I also interviewed de Kooning myself for 3 hours. I have that tape being digitized. I'll put it in the cloud for you to access. But de Kooning was so friendly to my father that when he got the gold medal from the Queen of Netherlands, he visited my father at his apartment in the Beacon Hotel on 74th Street and Broadway. And he was just a very close friend. He'd given my father the money, he said to his dealer, for cod, he says, give Kaldis the money from these pictures. And when I tried to keep the pictures, Foucault threatened to sue me. So I didn't have anything in paper that, about it, but I did get the money, but it was a sketchy kind of thing. He sold it to another art dealer, Pace Gallery, and over 2 years he got the money. And I got the money over 2 years. but I had to pay income tax because that put me over the income tax limit at the time. That was a big mistake. But nowadays, you don't have to worry about it. Only the billionaires have to pay income tax. And they figure out ways around it.
And then the CUNY sister, she saw something in your father and started painting him.
Yeah. He became very friendly with Elaine, especially when, Elaine was estranged from Bill. Bill had a child by a barmaid named Lisa. And my father, when Jason, my eldest, was a year old, we drove out in a VW van that we'd equipped to be able to sleep in. And Bill was in a barn that was a studio before he built the elegant studio he has now, or is still there, hopefully. What happened is Lisa was in the far background. He was very nice to me. I remember him on 8th Street when he had a studio on 8th Street, and he was always good to me, always smiling. He had a great sense of humor. So when I interviewed him and I said that my father said even the scribble on a napkin would be worth something by de CUNY, when I left with Elaine that night, it was the night of Reagan-Mondale debate, the last one in November, he came out of the kitchen with this rolled up paper with thumbtack holes in it. And it was a squiggle. It might have been the inspiration for his clam digger sculptures, but it was just it was a gracious scribble. I recently sold it. But Bill was the only painting. We gave him a painting because he'd given my father a painting. The only painting in his living room, unless they've changed things, was a painting by my father. And I have it on videotape of him pointing to a figure in the middle of the mountain. It's one of those Cycladic landscapes with the mountain and the sea. And he said, that's Kaldis' spirit. So they were very close. They were close to my mother, too. Guess who gave affidavits for my mother to divorce him in 1944? Elaine and Bill de CUNY. Both made up stories that my father had cheated on her. Whether it was true or not, I doubt, because when my father was in the hospital, joint diseases, when he was in his 70s, he would send me down the hall and said, look at that person. And it was somebody who reminded him of my mother. And once I got my parents together in Provincetown, and I went to the movies, and I came back, and there they were naked. They were very embarrassed, as much as I was embarrassed. And there was another time when where they were together, and I actually ran away because my father was doing everything to help this patient and friend of my mother. My mother by that time had quit the art business. When her boss from Buffalo and Providence was fired from the museum in Providence, she gave up on the art world, and she went back to school and got a degree in social work, and that's what she did until her death. And she was very good because I got when we had a memorial service for her, a lot of her patients came and said that, she had saved their marriage. And I kidded my mother. I said, you do a lot of marriage counseling. He said, how are you, you weren't good at your marriage, But, I learned later, dealing with my father as an adult, that he was impossible to live with. My mother never said that. The worst thing that my father ever said about my mother was that she was a sleeping Jesus, which is a double-edged, sword. Cuts both positive and negative. My mother had very little energy. She had polio as a child. When she would work, she would spend most of the weekend sleeping, and I would go to movies. During the week, I was shipped out at the age of 7 in Providence to a school that was very good, and I boarded by the week. And I'd come home on Friday, and I would go to movies on Saturday, morning, Saturday evening. One time I saw a movie 3 times in one weekend. But I always had dinners, meals with my mother. Those were good times. But she was a very frail woman, and she died at age 64.
Oh, young.
Yeah.
Your father, he had a sense that he was Greek, he was American, or you had a sense of being a descendant of a Greek. You had.
Yeah. Well, it was confusing when I went away to a very anglicized prep school. I felt like, I might have been the black there. There weren't any blacks at that time there. Now it's 59 different countries. So, they even have a director of synthesis. That's not the word they call it, but, director of inclusion. But at the time I went, I always felt like, I remember coming there the first day and I'd say, these tall, blonde, blue-eyed boys. That was most of them. But unlike Andover and Exeter, St. Paul's, they had Jews. For example, the famous DA, Morgenthau, went to Deerfield during World War II. He was there during the whole time. And then the boys had to plant potatoes. That was their physical activity. There were no sports then. They grew vegetables and potatoes.
Community.
Yeah. The headmaster had come there in 1904 on his way to law school from Amherst College, and he fell in love with a young woman in the town whose father had a thing, and the two of them became headmaster and headmistress. I'd had her as a teacher, Helen Boyden, but he was a tremendous influence in my life. He had the same ethical standards as my mother, very strict. He said, you boys are very privileged. He says, you've got to learn to give back. The late David Koch became a lifelong trustee of Deerfield because he gave so much money to Deerfield. And unlike his brother Charles, he gave a lot of money in New York City, both the American Ballet Theater and, of course, the David Koch Auditorium. But unfortunately, he died of pancreatic cancer at a fairly young age. He was 4 or 5 years behind me in school, but he was there my PG year. But my mother was a big influence in my life. It was interesting when she came and she liked one of my friend's watercolors. He gave it to her because he knew that she had been an art critic. For an art critic to say that it was good, his father was an economic professor at Harvard. He was from Australia, so Dick Smithies had a funny accent. And after I left Harvard, the father Smithies became the head of the Kirkland House that I lived in. But Dick was a big alternate on the New York musical scene. He married a gal who was in musicals while at Harvard.
So that's why I wanted to see if your father had a sense of Greekness, or
I'll tell you about that.
Or also you, because you had the name also.
Yeah, well.
And if he traveled to Greece after.
Yeah,
after
I've been
the
many
war,
times.
And how they received his work in Greece.
Okay, there's a problem there, which I'll talk about.
Yeah, I know.
You know about the problem?
that the copyrights and those things, right?
No, there's a problem that. Okay, where do you want me to begin?
No, the sense of Greekness.
Oh, my father. Okay, he took me to all the churches in New York and even to the Jewish church. That was his name for Temple Emmanuel. I went to St. Bartholomew's, the very elegant whatever it was, the Lutheran church that was on Park Avenue, and St. Patrick's. And he even took me on one Easter Eve to the cathedral that Penelope goes to, where Stephanopoulos is the pastor or whatever, rector, or all these names. Anyway, he had a lot of friends at the Greek National Herald. He taught me the meanings of words, for example, like sarcasm. Sarcasm means twisted flesh. So, if I'm smiling like this, and that's a sarcastic smile. He even pointed out that, uterus comes from the word hysteros, and of course hysterical. That's something that women are, hysterical. So my mother had a hysterical pregnancy. It's a false pregnancy, But I'm wondering now even if she had maybe a miscarriage, because my daughter had 2 miscarriages before each of her children. And then a surprise one many years later.
So those the Greek words that your father taught
Oh
you
yeah, it's constantly telling
also
me.
gave you a sense of Greekness too?
Yeah.
You
Oh
had the
yeah.
feeling-
He
had
gave
the
me
Greek-
an army language book with records, and the first phrase I learned was "Thelo mia bira, thelo mia krasi." That was the first words in this U.S. Army book.
Beer and wine.
Whatever. But Crossi, Bira came before Crossi.
Yeah.
Anyway, I did try to learn a little bit, but it wasn't a great teaching device. I did learn the Greek alphabet. He gave me a kiddies book on the Greek alphabet. I did learn that. I could say my name in Greek, Kalthis.
He gave you a boat also, right?
What?
Your
Oh,
father.
yeah. Well, my father was good at, these lectures on art, and I was teaching about the growth of it was ancient European history, and I was teaching about the development of Greece, and my father gave a lecture to me twice. We went together. He picked out the slides at the Metropolitan, which you could rent at the time. Regular slides, not like lantern slides that he used when he was lecturing at Carnegie Hall. And he gave that lecture to me twice. It basically went from Phoenician times to Egyptian to Minoan to Argos, and I gave that lecture without notes at my first job in Farmingdale. And my college professor turned chairman was in the audience with his class as well. And I got good reviews. But I learned from my father how to speak, and one time it really frightened me. And I see now how speaking, if you have that gift, it can be a very easily corrupted. I was afraid of it. I was at a school board meeting, and I listened like my father, and I took some of the points that were being said, and I refuted some of the negative points and came out with a synthesis at the end, and I got a rave, practically standing applause. That was scary. That kind of feedback was scary, even though I'd been teaching for a time at that point.
You are a historian, right?
Yeah, I studied history and lit, modern period of France, Germany, and Russia. And I was very fortunate to have. I started out in biochemistry, so I had chemistry and biology. In my sophomore year, I had organic chemistry, and I was told by the professor's wife, who was conducting the labs, that I was to go and purify cholesterol. They didn't even explain what cholesterol was at that point. This is 1956, fall of 56, and I came up with a heavier product. And I said, I can't do this. If I wanted to become a biochemist, I'm not going to be able to do the research. I'm just not precise enough. And the other thing I didn't like was that the other people in the laboratory were like this. They were almost as if they had horse blinders on, headed toward medical school. So I didn't like it. And I got a lot of advantages. I got private instruction in German literature. because I was late coming into the history and lit program in the middle of my sophomore year. Then the next year I had the son of a famous world history book author that was used in schools. Very great mind teaching me Russian intellectual history. And when I started teaching, the superintendent had realized that I had studied about Russia, and he advertised in both the Daily News and the New York Times that I was going to give Russian history at this school. And this was 1960, was the first year you could use the word socialism in the classroom. Up until that time, it had been banned for New York teachers to even use the word. But it didn't get enough people to fly. Then I had the idea, hey, I can teach history through movies. And I found a place to get the Russian movies, and it wasn't a matter of the money, it was just that only 3 or 4 people signed up. So the whole thing was dropped.
So Eisenstein.
But I spent most of my career.
What kind of movies you played?
Oh, it would have been Potemkin and, you know, I would have started with that.
The classics.
Yeah, I would have started with Potemkin. But, yeah, I had a professor who was a civil servant in Russian history at the time of the revolution. He heard shots in the street. He was such a timid guy. He went back into his apartment and came out 4 days later, and he said, the revolution was over. And I saw his last lecture. He retired that year. Everybody from the history department was there. Schlesinger Jr. was there. I took his course in American intellectual history. But I never took American history as such in college. But I had a great teacher in...
You went to Harvard?
Yeah.
How expensive was Harvard?
$800 tuition. And guess what? I had to pay, I had applied for a scholarship, and room and board. I lived in a house that was built in 1660, and it was $60 a semester for the room, and I think it was $150 a semester for food. Okay? So my total expenses were $1,100 plus books. I figured out my expenses at Harvard while I was there, 5 years, averaged about $2,500. That means my expenses not just during the school year, but during the summer too. You know, so I had to have $2,500. My mother, I was convinced I had skipped a grade in elementary school, and the headmaster told my mother he didn't think I was emotionally mature enough to go to Harvard. He had said that to another boy who came from a toy family, you know, Mark's toy family. He'd gone to Harvard despite what the headmaster had said. But my mother, you know, revered authorities, and she believed that he was right to do that. And so I stayed another year at Deerfield, and I was one of the stars in Clarence Day's Life with Father. I played Mother. And the guy, we both went to Harvard the next year, the father and the mother. And the father was he had a lifetime job. He was the financial advisor to Mrs. Astor, and until she died. And he was like the last person to leave one of the 5 towns. And after that, they could put the cloth over the street to make it safe for Orthodox Jews to walk. Anyway.
So your father was very proud of you going to Harvard.
Yeah.
And supporting
your
education.
My father criticized me again and again. He compared me to my uncle Christos, who was a very elegant man, very bright. He'd studied agronomy in Italy. When I first met my uncle, I had to speak to him in a combination of Italian phrases that I knew from Latin and French, because all upper class, you know, Greeks knew French at the time. And, you know, he would call me a Babbitt, or he'd call, you're just like the Babbitt, my uncle. You know, my uncle was the head of tobacco in Greece. he negotiated deals with all the foreign companies for Greek tobacco. And during the colonel's time, he lost his super pension. Guess why? He was the head of the resistance in the Eastern Aegean during World War II. But Christos was a very, very good man. And I told my family, I said, you know, when I met Christos finally in '72, I realized that my father was really complimenting me, even though he thought he wanted me to be more like him.
So,
Not, more free-spirited, less uptight, less bourgeois. The word Babbitt, was the word from the novel. He used that a lot, overused it. But when I interviewed other people, for example, at lunch one time, there was a Greek parent in Sleepy Hollow. It was like a parents' luncheon for the teachers. And I said, he said, oh, I met your father. He said, your father married a princess. He said, and you were like the head of your class at Harvard. You would exaggerate everything. My mother's family and my cousin's family, Eglingtons, were on a chart, a genealogy chart called a bar sinister, from the Earl of Eglinton's family. The Earl of Eglinton today's name is Montgomery, with a French spelling. Okay? It's the Montgomery clan. But it was called the Earl of Eglinton. The Eglinton Castle, which is now in ruins, was the last, in 1935, was the last tournament to be held. And guess who was there? Queen Victoria was in attendance at this tournament, the last medieval tournament. But so there was this sketchy relationship of a man who came from Scotland to the Midlands with money, but no known family. And his sister went to Canada after she married, another Scot.
In the 50s, along with Aristodimos, there were some other Greek-American painters, like, let's say, Chios or Daphnis.
He was a good friend of Daphnis and Chios. He hated the other guy, the guy that became more famous because a Greek gallery owner did it. The guy that was
You mean Stamos?
Stamos, yeah. In 1973, I was 36 years old, and I was embarrassed by my father acting like a child. He was chasing Stamos all over the exhibit of the USA, calling him a faggot, homosexual. My father was, it actually, I would say it did a lot to impair his saleability, because he also made fun of Meyer Shapiro, who was the professor of art history at Columbia, who trained most of the critics in New York. And the only critic who liked my father was Hilton Kramer. And later, Hilton Kramer, when I asked him, can I use your name? And I guess he knew that, he said, I wouldn't do that if I were you. Because Hilton Kramer, in a case where a building had gotten garbage art, wanted to remove it because it started to smell, the artists for this garbage art won the case. And Hilton Kramer was called in by the management as a thing that, this was not art. And the judge, in his decision, said, Hilton Kramer only likes dead artists. So, he was, the problem was at the time that he was with Mrs. Cornbly. She was a fledgling art dealer, coming from a wealthy family in the theater and, large buildings. She had mortgages up the kazoo. My father never had to worry about making money on the sales because she would keep it and give him an 8% interest. That's what she was getting in mortgages at the time. And she would only give him the money when she sold a mortgage. When the accountants told her to sell a mortgage. And one time I sent her check in. My father used me as my address, as his address in the suburbs, so he didn't have to pay New York sales tax. The check bounced because she hadn't put the money in to cover it yet. She would tell my father when to cash the check. But no, my father, he was a good friend of Hios and more than Lakakis. He was very, very fond of Lakakis. Lakakis was a brilliant sculptor.
Lucas Amara?
And also George Constant
Constant.
was a very good friend. I've had lots of discussions with Georgette. I think Georgette's done a better job of getting her father's work out there, although he did a lot of work on paper, so it's easier to get works on paper into museums and galleries. But no, it's, my father also was a very big friend of Sally Avery, and Sally Avery was told to me to be my advisor when he died, and I went to her and she says 3 things. 1, you keep it out in front of the public eye. 2, you buy it back if it's below what value you think it should be. And 3, get a scribe. And the latter I did not get. And that's probably a good reason why. I'll give you an example. De Kooning became famous when Elaine was sleeping with Thomas Hess. Thomas Hess wrote the first book on de Kooning. De Kooning actually, discussed art with my father a lot. Another person that he knew was Mercedes Matter, but I never realized she was an artist because I knew she was married to a famous photographer, Herbert Mather, who was an associate professor at Yale. He commuted to New Haven a couple of times a week, and I knew his son, who was about my age, Alexander. And not until I was with the dealer Borghi, and he bought all of Alexander's mother's paintings, did I realize this woman was an outstanding painter, and I only knew her as a sexy mother. And, the rumors were that she slept with many, many people, and a lot of the paintings that she had went to, boyfriends. But my first introduction to her was I walked into her apartment on McDougal Alley, which was right up against a skyscraper on Fifth Avenue, and there was a grand piano, and on the right was a Pollock, and then beyond the grand piano was a picture of Mercedes with topless in front of the same picture. I knew Mercedes' aunt, and my father, this was another artist that my father knew, she would put me up on Beekman Place. Her name was Sarah Carls Johns. She was the younger sister of Arthur Carls, who was in the original Armory show. Arthur Carls had married a Mexican woman who was named Mercedes, but Mercedes had was given at birth a very Anglo name like Janine or something that she didn't want. But when her mother was banished by her rich father, she took up the name Mercedes. And I saw her last at the memorial service for Bill de Kooning. She still was strikingly beautiful. Very elegant woman and very talented.
It is clear that your father's work, Aristodimos Kaldis' work, was very well received from the American audience, let's say.
Yeah. And especially by artists.
By artists,
yeah.
American artists, and also it was well received from the early days, even in museums, in art galleries. How was the Greek American community received, if they knew about your father, or how your father was received in Greece?
Okay, the problem in Greece was that he had a close friend, Kostas Zimerakis. I don't know if you were aware of him, but when my father died, Kostas started painting things that looked like my father. If you go to the Bayside Diner, on either side of the Bayside Diner are Kaldis landscapes painted by Kostas Zimerakis. Annie Zimerakis, Kostas' only wife, did a panegyric, an interview in Gynekon in Greek. So I don't know what it said, but you know, she was very, that's how, I guess, you know, he had seen this article and he became basically like my father's sidekick. And my father convinced him to leave his brother, who had the, who was a commercial ad agency, George Tsimarakis, and become a painter full time. But occasionally he would do commercial things just to make life. Unfortunately, he died of pancreatic cancer, refusing to get treated. I've had pancreatic cancer. I was treated, and I'm still healthy. It's now 4 years later. But you know, I think there was a guy with a single name who was hovering around Kostas, and I think he somehow got a hold of some of these paintings that he did, and he was selling them in Greece as Kaldises. Kouros had, Angelos Kamilos of Kouros had me do this elaborate, you know, essay saying I was the only son of Aristodimos Kaldis, and these are ethic, and he had me stamp my father's signature and my signature on the back of the canvases. But he couldn't get sales in Greek galleries for that reason. People were suspect. In other words, the market had been polluted by paintings that were not by my father, but in his style. So that's misfortunate.
He was reading Greek newspapers or listening to Greek music.
Yeah. Well, he only listened to Greek music after his leg was amputated. In other words, before that, his attitude when we'd visit a friend, for example, John Groth's former lover, had married a Greek man, and they lived in one of those small apartments, but in a very elegant neighborhood on Ball Park Avenue. And they had WQXR playing in the background. And, once my father even said to me the same thing. He said, well, these people don't have any thoughts. They have to have music in the background. One time I had music in the car when I was driving him. He says, don't you ever have time for thoughts? And irony is, sometimes when I get back from exercise and I'm parking the car, I just sit there for a few minutes looking at the skyline and the clouds and just relaxing. But that's my best place to meditate because there's no distractions. Sitting in the driver's seat of a car, if you're not driving, there's no distractions. But no, my father was, he had a lot of pupils. Men stretched his canvases, guested his canvases. Women actually did housekeeping for him. One woman who was very fond of my father, Janet Bossy, bought him, a nice suit, so he had a pinstripe suit. She bought him a TV. And only in the last 5 years of his life did he listen to Greek music on the radio and watched and have TV, have the sound in back. Unfortunately, I couldn't get him to go to Burke, which my mother had gone to one time when she had, need to have a rehab. And he refused to go there. He said, nobody will come and visit me. He wanted to be in a rehab, at the regular hospital. Unfortunately, at Burke, what they did is they get you out of bed at 8 o'clock in the morning or 7:30, and you get dressed, and then you eat. My father would sit around after he had his leg removed in his wheelchair until noon before he did anything. But as a child, we would go 1 block. It would take 45 minutes. He would talk to everyone.
Very social.
Yeah, very social. By the way, I'm a big fan of Dr. Ruth, and I've heard her say on 2 occasions that one of the ways you stay young is to talk to strangers. And, be involved. Don't be just into yourself. And I do that. Sometimes it annoys the people I'm with.
How about the guy? How about you? You You play Greek music. You enjoy Greek food.
Well, I don't play Greek.
Visit
I don't
Greece?
play Greek music, but I remember my father had this one song that he'd play again and again on a record. It would end a popsy or something. Something was a popsy, and he would explain that.
Yeah, popsy, ne?
Yeah, and he would explain that most of these songs were agricultural. In other words, they were carrots and things. You are like a, whatever. You're like a rose, or you're like a artichoke, or
Symbolism.
yeah, the symbolism of metaphors, basically.
Yeah, metaphors.
Metaphors. I mean, you're like a rose. You're pretty on the outside and thorns inside. I think that's a Greek song, right? Something like that. Anyway, but no, he liked in music. His taste was Wagner. He loved the very dramatic, operas.
The ring, the cycle of the
the ring cycle. My mother said she once saw the ring cycle in one day. Can you believe that? Morning, afternoon, and evening.
How about you?
I like. My father used to take me to the Fifth Avenue Cinema, and there I saw.
Greek movies.
No, we saw French movies mostly, but we saw a really great movie, Red Shoes, and I was very influenced by that. And another movie that was about dancing was called Spectre and the Rose. Not too many people know about that. It's a black and white, and it's one of these movies where art imitates life, or life imitates art. Life imitates art. In other words, the ballet has somebody leaping to their death at the end. The movie had somebody doing, leaping to the death. It was produced by Helen, what's her name? The famous actress. I went to school with her son. Who was from Hawaii Five-0. MacArthur, Helen. No, but her name was something else. She married MacArthur. Helen Hayes MacArthur.
Interesting.
But one of her husband was behind that. Anyway, long story short, he knew artists who were also ballet dancers, and I went to lofts in a village for dancing. And that painting that I showed you earlier of the boat was at a dancer choreographer's, suburban getaway next to a mill stream, which ran all night long during the hurricane. And in 1982, I took a young woman who I was fond of, who was very well connected, and I wanted to impress her, to the New York City Ballet. And I've been going for 42 years since then.
Wow. When is the last time you went to Greece?
Last time I went to Greece, I took my grandson at age 12, which is now 10 years ago.
What Greece
We went on the...
meant to you? Because you're an American of some Greek descent.
Yeah, well, I certainly...
And also as a historian, which
Well,
is a country
I'll
with
give you
a
an
long
example.
history, yeah.
Give you an example. The headmaster of the elementary school I went to, his grandfather was Edward Everett, who was the great Greek scholar,
yeah.
and he was a great Phil Lane, and
Yeah.
also, Harvard College president, senator, governor, you name it. So I grew up knowing from my father that, Greece had a great culture. I also saw, how people respected him. He had a friend, Jerry Stefanatos, who had a business called Candioplastic. He basically transliterated the name for pastry shops in Greece. Say it in Greek.
Yes.
Sakharoplastia. And my father said he started this business when the Waldorf was having a dinner for President Truman, and they wanted to have a superlative cake. So my father would take me there when I visit. It was on 85th and Columbus. And I would eat Louis Sherry ice cream and little cookies while my father, for 2 hours, would talk in Greek about the classics to this would-be sculptor, pastry man. And at my Deerfield graduation, I had the most elegant cake. It was an open book. And my father carried my Harvard graduation cake on the train up to Route 128, because I was over my marriage, the wedding cake. That was it, the wedding cake, because I got married when I was in college. I got married before my senior year. My wife was a junior, but he was constantly in my life. I think my mother was a little upset when I moved to New York that he was more in my life now than he had been as a child. But my father was constantly gregarious. I did stay with him for 1 week after I lost my house in separation prior to divorce, and he tried to treat me as if I were that little boy. Have you tied your shoes in the morning? And I finally said, I told my wife, and she let me sleep on the couch in the living room until I got my apartment on the end of October, the 1st of October. But what I realized is that this tremendous extroversion was a cover for feeling rather frightened as an individual. And I only learned by describing my wife's activities from a psychiatrist that I misunderstood her acting out as that she was feeling very threatened herself. In other words, the relationship was threatening to what she wanted to be. And what happened is, after she got custody of the kids, she didn't come home till 9:10, and finally I said to her, when my father was in the hospital, I said, you don't really have to be a custodial parent to have the love of your children. And she agreed, and we told my father that the next night we were going to tell the kids this, and he died overnight, that night. Happy, probably, that, my children, his grandchildren, wouldn't be with a former drug addict.
But he left a large number of work, right?
Yeah, about 350 paintings. And I keep on finding other things. Among things, he had every single clipping from a newspaper or a magazine. For example, he had 3 magazines from Grand Central Art, and I gave the late art dealer, all of a sudden I'm forgetting his name, it's an Irish name, but he was with that guy that, the art dealer that was put in jail because he used his artist's work as collateral to buy stuff in the Ponzi scheme. Salvador O'Reilly, Bill O'Reilly, 3rd generation in art. His grandfather had art, an art business, and so I gave him. I had 3 copies of something that showed his grandfather, and I gave it to him. He was very touched. Mrs. Cornbly showed him the paintings that were in the warehouse, but he never decided to, I didn't realize she was showing him that because she was thinking of retiring. Unfortunately, I've had bad luck with dealers since. With my first dealer after Miss Cornbly was Sid Deutsch, and he sold a painting to a person I actually knew and went to China with. I could have sold him the painting myself. I felt that was rather difficult, that I had to pay, half the money to him. And then Kouros was in the thing, and we had differences of how we should sell them. And then I went to Mark Borghi, and Borghi never sold anything. And I later found out from somebody who I had worked with when I ran a gallery briefly with a real estate broker in Southampton. I realized how difficult it was to sell things. And the irony was, when I had an exhibit of Kostas Simirakis, an exhibit of a very good French-American painter who did, you know, the things you do on glass plates, and a good friend of my father who's a really good artist. I didn't sell anything out of those places, but during the group shows, I got two things. So fortunately, I only lost $500 on that old deal. But it was difficult. I was working with a guy that was a total fraud.
Statistics show that during the pandemic, investing into paintings and art, it was at the rise.
Yeah.
How do you explain that?
Well, a lot of people are using art now as to clean dollars. It's a way of cleaning dollars. They even buy art. They avoid paying taxes. They put them in international zones, you know, shipping containers or whatever. There's a whole bunch of places like that. They're even doing TV programs now and movies about it. It's unfortunate. I think what happened is, at the time that my father had a chance of breaking out in the art thing, that's when Andy Warhol came along. And after Andy Warhol, it was all about marketing, because he was a marketer. He had nothing of real value. He was a good marketer. The fact that, you know, some dash painting that somebody else did in his studio can get millions of dollars is ridiculous. But that's it. Art has become a commodity.
And in concluding our wonderful interview, how you, not only as a son of Aristotle, not only as a guy, but also as a historian and also a person who understands and enjoys art.
Mm-hmm.
What is, you think, the contribution of Aristodimos' work to the American society in terms of painting, and also what do you like to be the legacy of your father for the next generations? Well,
fascinating that I think I may have mentioned to you on the phone, but I should reinvent it. My father learned to paint from me. I have a painting that I can show you on my cell phone that my mother folded up. A guy, age 2, it said on the back. It was it was some kind of finger paint, watercolor thing. And, you know, I did paint with my father in Buffalo when he would come and visit. And I did once do a painting in his studio that he kept forever, in a 5th Avenue studio. But, you know, I wasn't inspired to do it. I liked photography, but I didn't like the idea of selling photographs for money. I didn't want to, you know, it's the best photographs I've taken are not, you know, they're not saleable. And I wouldn't want to be that way. And that was the same feeling I had when I was a waiter. And I think my father understood that, because he was named as a waiter in that arrest record, protesting Sacco and Vanzetti's execution. When you are waiting on table, there's a subtle reaction of the personality and the people in terms of the thing. Unless you're like me, who was a waiter, I constantly give 20%. You know, I double the payment, which is a little bit more than 20% if you consider that the tax is added in. My ex-wife would always do 18%, and she would calculate the pre-tax part. I just, you know, having been a waiter, and she was a waiter too. My father tried to get us to be a waiter, I mean, to run a restaurant, you know, in one of those under stoop kind of places. And I said, no. You say, you have no idea. We've been in the restaurant business. You have no idea of how difficult it is to run a restaurant. But, you know, my father, you know, he always said that he would be remembered by other artists. You know, he was a giant in the New York Art School. There's a book that Pavia's widow put together. I forgot the title. I'll get back to you on it. But the whole chapter is about my father speaking about the relationship of art to the world outside, and whether the Colossus, where the art is in the Colossus, or is it outside the Colossus? And the problem I think he always saw was that that especially as he became more popular, that art was a commodity, and he had 21 bank accounts when he died. He didn't spend any money recklessly, you know. So I was quite comfortable, and I was able to buy a house when I got my children back. But you know, it's you know, my son, my eldest son, was going to be with him for a couple of weeks, and that fell through. But he did do something else in architecture, and he became an architect. But his son, seeing the paintings that my son has in his house, at age 3 started painting like my grandfather. So there's painting in the blood. Even a granddaughter now that's 19 likes to paint occasionally. Unfortunately, her introduction to painting was sort of bad. I remember taking my eldest son to summer school, and the painter at CP Hollow basically had all his students paint like him, and my father was horrified. But no, my father didn't have, he had the respect of students. He had a birthday party every year. We always went Dutch. And when my father died, we hired the Mofettis restaurant. We paid for a band, and everybody paid their own way. And my eldest son did all the communications and picking up the checks, and the people actually sent money in envelopes in those days. But it was a great time. And one woman complained, Dorothy Block, who was a big fan of my father. She said, "This is such a happy occasion, I can't cry." But that's what my father would have liked, you know. You know, I did go with him to a funeral of his best friend, my dentist, who was memorialized in the first issue of Ms. magazine as my mother, the dentist. Her son was Nicholas von Hoffman, who had a you know, post-syndicate column, was on Counterpoint, you know. But my father was his mentor, because his father was an explorer in Africa. And in this article called My Mother the Dentist, the first page is all about his mother. The second page was all about my father, without mentioning his name. But when I asked him to write about my father, he says, "I don't do eyepieces." Unfortunately, he died a year to the day after I moved here, and it was 4 years ago. But he wrote the best-selling book about Roy Cohn that was made into an HBO thing. He wrote about his tutor that was also Obama's tutor, Saul Alinsky. I didn't particularly like that book, but he was a very prolific author. He started in writing. He didn't go to college, but you know, he had my father. And my father, by the way, was very much against college. He says college makes you infantilizes you. So I wonder what he would think now about colleges, where the students are so rowdy.
Yeah, also your experience as a teacher, now education, because of advances in technology, it is some kind of a lot of influence there. What do you think about the future of education in our days?
Well, I think the COVID time had an opportunity to do something, but unfortunately the school districts weren't able to be creative and bring the students together, the way that they did with exercise classes from Nassau County. But my granddaughter who went to a nursing college, Malloy College, she just could not understand the professors the way they were teaching on the Zoom, and she didn't do well. So she switched to Queensborough College, and she's going to go somewhere else. But I think the best thing, I once saw a California public TV program where they mentioned the idea that school should be like an architect's studio, where the students are working and sharing. And the interesting thing is my granddaughter Audrey, who started at age 5 in Belrose, Queens, in an all-Indian neighborhood where she was often one of two light-skinned Caucasians, Koreans, Chinese, South Asians. Her best friends were alternately Indians, Sri Lankese, or Korean. A lot of her friends now are Korean. But in that, the teachers would place the kids in groups of 6, the desks all pushed together. So there was constantly cooperation. And I think that's a good way to do it. And she had because it was gifted and talented, they hired the best teachers. And now they're doing away with the program. I don't know if you were aware of that. Do you have kids in school?
No.
No? You're lucky. If I were to say anything about the future of education, I think the thing to do would be to get rid of the administrators. In other words, make the administrators less important. Make them have the status of janitors. In other words, do the financial things, review bills, etc. But most of the people who rise to become principals and superintendents these days are really mediocre people. I retired at 55, 30 years ago, because I couldn't stand being told how to teach from people who couldn't even spell the word chalk correctly. 2 out of 3. Both became superintendents afterwards. I had one really good administrator, and he had the same background as I did, Harvard and Harvard Ed School. And as I like to say it, he was nicer than me, and he was smarter than me. But when I started teaching on Long Island, it was very difficult. I either outshone people or I threatened people. It was difficult. I think the biggest problem is we don't respect teachers as they should be. My father always said, calling on the Russian, he said, when a principal goes to a school in Russia, a limo takes him there. In other words, teachers are very much respected. A guy that used to cut my hair told me that growing up in Italy, his father would always walk and catch the teacher who was walking in the evening. It's a Mediterranean thing to walk in the evening. My father did a lot. And he would ask how things went that day with, him. So he was very careful to be on his best behavior in school. I mean, they even, in Italy, they call the teachers professori, So I think that's unfortunate.
Or maestro, yeah, it's very prestigious.
Yeah.
Also, as a historian, you are very much aware that the American society had divisions before. What
Yeah.
is your assessment of the current situation? Is this a divided society? Is there any hope to
I think it is,
to
because
reconcile?
what we have is people like Ron DeSantis, who's Yale and Harvard educated, acting like fools because they think that fools will relate to that, and they figure that most of the voting public are fools. Trump played, he says, "I love uneducated people." A direct quote from Trump. And there's a quote on the door of Malvern School District that had a big interracial problem that I reported on when I was teaching in the Institute of the U.S. Education in Southampton College. Malvern Elementary School. It said, education can help you. A person who is not educated becomes a slave. A person who's educated can't be enslaved. Something, I mean, I've not paraphrased it exactly right.
Yeah.
But
The value of education.
yeah, but it's that, you know, we also tried to educate everyone the same way. The German system is the one that I've seen is the best. They take out the people like de Kooning went to a vocational education in Holland. A German kid at 11 who wants to be a car mechanic starts studying automobile mechanics. At 14, the kids that are still left in the regular school that don't see themselves leading an academic life or going into professions that involve things, you know, they want to be a medical technician, they go into what is called a Realschule. And I think that's a much better system. And when we had kids visit from a gymnasium outside of Stuttgart to our school and vice versa, I could see that, you know, these kids were far and above even my honors class. And I know my eldest son said that when he went to Ossining from Long Island, he took 2 grades in West Islip, where we lived, and he said very quickly after the first grade, it was clear which kids would pay attention to the teacher and which kids wouldn't. And that's where the divide came. In other words, there are people who care not for learning and care not for democratic governance. Democratic governance is difficult. It's a lot simpler to say, "Hail Hitler," and let a crazy man do all your bidding. And supposedly there are quite a few people, they're doing polls now, there are quite a few people, especially the people in these militias, they're very happy with the dictatorship. That's what they want.
So, as an educator,
I'm worried. I think the guy down the street that's Portuguese American is doing the right thing to go back to Portugal. Because I think the future for his kids is either getting shot in a school or getting past drugs in a school, you know. And
so what would be your advice to young students or suggestion to?
do your best. Do your best. In other words, if you don't understand academics, learn a trade, learn something that you can do. Some of the most successful people in the technology business left college in the middle of it. You know, the 2 most famous, you know, Microsoft and Facebook did that. Obviously, that's not for everyone, but I think my father was right that college often infantilizes, especially if you just go through the motion. And the thing that I think is terrible is the fraternities. My eldest brother-in-law got into Northwestern. He was just as bright as his sister. She got into Northwestern, and he drunked out. Went to BU, got all A's, got back in. But he ended up going to graduate school in St. Louis, but he neglected to get a deferment, and he ended up in the Pentagon doing health papers. And he became a radical and helped organize the march against the Pentagon within the Pentagon. And unfortunately, he died of cancer because he got involved in the outer parts of Washington, D.C. As you get into the triple alphabet, the neighborhoods get more, even the white neighborhoods get more sketchy, and drugs are prolific. I think drugs are a big part of the problem. Guns are definitely part of the problem. I think if we do, I think we've totally misinterpreted the Second Amendment. It doesn't mean that everybody has to have a gun. It says a well-organized militia. The only well-organized militias are ones that are traitors, seditious. So I don't know. I just hope my grandchildren can seek out good lives, but I'm not as confident as I was when my children went out into the world. I think it was a more promising time. Yeah.
Thank you very much,
Yeah.
Guy Kaldis, and I would like to document in public your generous gesture to donate one painting of Aristodimos Kaldis to the Hellenic American Project and Queen's College, and thank you very much. And when the protocols are off, we're going to have a great event at Queen's College.
Okay.
We memorialize that. And also, I would like you to know that Queen's College, either the Benjamin Rothschild Library or the Hellenic American Project Library and Archives would be more than glad to accommodate you to catalog some of the archives
Okay.
of the family that exists, and to take care of it. And we hope that we'll continue writing and publishing some books on you and on your father.
That'd be great.